What does it mean to be more righteous than the Pharisees? Hey everyone, I'm Matthew Vanderils, one of the community pastors at Founded in Truth Fellowship. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and click that little bell to be notified whenever we post new content or go live every week with our weekly church services. Also, feel free to comment below. We would love to hear your thoughts on this topic. If you feel a desire to click the dislike button, well, we will think of you as a righteous Pharisee. In this Fitbit, we are going to look at what Yeshua meant when he said we needed to be more righteous than the Pharisees. Well, let's start out by checking out the verse in the Bible. Matthew 5:20. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So the setting of this verse is when Yeshua is giving the most powerful sermon ever preached, and that is the Sermon on the Mount. This is the sermon where Yeshua lays out what it means to keep Torah or keep God's law from your heart. That is really what he orbits around during the entire sermon, keeping the Torah from the heart and fulfilling the vocation of being a fully human being that bears God's image in your thoughts, actions, and pursuits. Here, Yeshua is telling us how a Jeremiah 31 people keep the Torah. And this verse is pretty potent when we look at it in context. Now, I must say, I have had a lot of friends that have viewed this verse in a way that ends up actually being a bit destructive, and that is viewing this verse as if you need to be more legalistic in your pursuits or have a stricter regiment of keeping God's law than the Pharisees did. And hey, that's easy to do. Like, you might be thinking, Yeshua is saying, oh, just do what the Pharisees do and turn it up a couple notches. As if Yeshua is saying to be the uber Pharisee. When we take a look at the rest of the gospel accounts, this is not what Yeshua actually does. When Yeshua tells a man to carry a bed on Shabbat, carry furniture on Shabbat, that was not very Pharisee-like. How about healing on the Sabbath? We see that really isn't very Pharisee-like either. And when it was a very liberal Pharisee thing to do. How about when Yeshua tells his disciples to harvest grain on Shabbat? Yeah, it was very un-Pharisee-like, as we saw. Invite the unclean to sit with you at a table and dine? Allow prostitutes to fellowship with you? Tax collectors? Sinners? Very un-Pharisee. So I don't think we have any grounds to say that Yeshua is trying to say be stricter than the Pharisees. And so we really have to build up exactly what Yeshua is getting at here. Remember, he's just started the most powerful sermon ever preached in history. And we have to take into account that he is about to explain to us how we become more righteous than the scribes and the Pharisees. He says things like, don't hate your neighbor in your heart. Don't lust and objectify others in your heart. Be authentic and don't use God's name as collateral for your areas of lacking. Be bold, promoting the one you serve, and love others because that is the sum goal of the Torah. This is how you are more righteous than the Pharisees and the scribes. If we want a little bit more evidence, though, we can turn to the latter part of Matthew's account regarding Yeshua's engagement and criticism of the Pharisees. See, in Matthew 22, an expert in the Torah comes, a Pharisee, and he asks Yeshua what the greatest commandment in the Torah is. Matthew 22:35. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all of the law and the prophets. Yeshua's response? Love God, love man. Love. And when we look at the 10 commandments, we have verses 1 through 4 having to do with kind of loving God, and 5 through 10 having to do with loving your neighbor. Now, I guess we could make the case that all of them have to do with loving God, but on a practical level, this is how they can be split. When we see Yeshua criticizing the Pharisees, we don't see him criticizing how they kept the commandments that have to do with loving God. No, they did those great. But he seemed to accuse them of devaluing and abolishing the commandments of loving your neighbor. In Matthew 23, he builds up on his prophecies about the destruction of Jerusalem in Matthew 24. He lets it loose on the Pharisees, and here are some of the things he said to them. Chapter 23, verse 4. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders. But they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. Matthew 23:23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. So the entire chapter is just a brutal criticism. But his accusation is that they do a lot of stuff on the outside, but they lack actually doing anything that pursues the kingdom of God. They spend all their energy tithing little herbs, but don't pursue loving their neighbor, bringing justice to their neighbor, or having mercy on their neighbor. not even being faithful to their neighbor. They lack in all of these areas. Be better than them. Because if you have no love for your neighbor, for the person sitting next to you, for the person out in the world, for the person that hates you even, for that person that broke your trust, for that person who hurt you, you can't love God. If you cannot love someone who has offended you, it is impossible for the love of God to shine through you. Let your righteousness be greater than that of the Pharisees. Participate in following Yeshua and bearing the suffering of the world so that God's light can shine through you. For if you cannot love greater than the Pharisees, you will never taste the peace, the mercy, and the grace of the kingdom of God has to offer. That's what Yeshua said. So, in summary, Jesus says in Matthew 5:20 that unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Many think this means to just be stricter than the Pharisees were. But when we look at Yeshua's actual example he lived out, as well as the criticism of the Pharisees, we find that we're called to live out the love for our neighbor greater than the Pharisees did. That is where they had a deficit. It is only when we come to a place where our hearts beat for other people that we enter into the peace and the love and the shalom of God's kingdom. If you enjoyed this message, go ahead, give us a like. If you didn't, feel free to give us a dislike. Please let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And hey, don't forget to subscribe and hit that little bell to be notified whenever we upload new content or go live with our weekly church services, Saturdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Stay fit, stay founded in truth.